Okay, let's get started. I welcome all of you to panel discussion on changing corporate governance in Japan. I am Takeo Hoshi, Director of Stanford Japan Program here at APAC, Asia Pacific Research Center. And this is the final event of the Japan program this academic year. And we saved the best for the last. Corporate governance reform has been important, actually a top agenda for Japan's Abenomics economic reform. And the reform in this area has not been just a talk. There have been some real changes. And we can find some drastic changes that have been happening for Japanese corporations in the last couple of years. So today, I invited two leaders of this fundamental change happening in Japan to update to update us with the latest information about the efforts to improve corporate governance in Japan and speculate where Japanese corporations are going in the near future. So let me briefly introduce panelists. Mr. Masaaki Tanaka, over there, is Representative Director and Deputy President of MUFG, the Mitsubishi UFJ Financial Group, the largest financial group in Japan. He's also a board member of Morgan Stanley and Vice Chairman of the Board of Counselors of the US-Japan Council. His primary location is in Tokyo, but his job takes him all around the world. Mr. Tanaka, well known as Masa to many of us, is especially familiar with the Bay Area because he was the president and CEO of Union Bank from 2007 to 2010. So welcome back to the Bay Area. Between the Union Bank CEO position and his current position, he was the CEO for the Americas for the Bank of Tokyo Mitsubishi UFJ. Currently, Masa directly reports to the CEO of MUFG with general responsibility to oversee all business groups of MUFG, including overseas business. And his responsibility also includes oversight over corporate functions, including corporate governance, today's topic, strategic and financial planning, and enterprise risk management. So I don't know what he doesn't do for MUFG. And the most relevant for today's session is that Mr. Tanaka has been leading the corporate governance reform at MUFG, which he will talk about. Mr. Tanaka holds a law degree from the University of Tokyo and a Master of Laws from the University of Michigan Law School. The other panelist, Mr. Kazuhiko Toyama, is CEO of IGPI, Industrial Growth Platform, Inc. He had started his career with Boston Consulting Group and later became a founding member of CDI, Corporate Directions, Inc., a Tokyo-based management consulting firm, and eventually he became its CEO. In 2003, he was appointed to lead Industrial Revitalization Corporation of Japan, which is a government-backed restructuring fund, which played an important role in restructuring the troubled companies in Japan back then. And he was the COO of that restructuring fund, IRCJ. In 2007, after IRCJ successfully completed its mission, he founded IGPI. He also holds a law degree from the University of Tokyo and holds an MBA from Stanford University's GSB, Graduate School of Business. So welcome back to Stanford. Thank you. And Kazu is also a vice chairperson of Keizai Douyukai, Japan Association of Corporate Executives, outside director of Omron Corporation and PIA Corporation, and member of many government committees, too many to mention here, including Committee for Japan's Corporate Governance Code. So Now, I will start by giving a very brief background on the current efforts of corporate governance reform in Japan, and then I will ask first Kazu to talk about 20 minutes on the corporate governance reform in Japan, and I'm especially interested to hear about your experience as a member of a corporate governance code committee. And then after Kazu, I invite Masa to talk for about 20 minutes too. And of course here, I would be very interested in hearing about the corporate governance reform at MUFG that you have been leading. So let me start moving to this podium. So as I said, the corporate governance reform is at the top of the government reforms or the Abenomics economic policy reform that Japan has been working on. So this is from 2014 document about a year ago. The Abenomics or the current administration came up with 10 key areas of economic reform. And as you can see, enhancing corporate governance is at the top. And here, as I briefly said, the efforts have been real. So it wasn't just a talk, and they have been doing some real economic reforms. And I just mentioned 3 of the major moves in this area of enhancing corporate governance, which the Japanese government has already been working on. In 2014, they established Stewardship Code, which defines the principle for institutional investors to follow. And then now they're following that up with establishment of Corporate Governance Code, which is a principle that corporations should follow. And as a member of government committee, Kazu has been involved in this establishment of Corporate Governance Code. And the related thing, the third thing I just put up here, an important event or important change related to the enhancing of corporate governance is an introduction of a new stock price index called JPX 400. And this stock price index is not just the average stock prices of representative companies or the large companies, but these are the average stock prices for 400 good companies or companies with high appeal to investors, which include some conditions for the corporate governance. So there are some more slides for stewardship and the corporate governance code, but these, I guess Kazu will talk about some of those. So let me just mention a little bit more about JPX 400. So as I said, that this is the stock price index for 400 good or attractive companies for Japan. And those are selected based on some quantitative measures like average ROE or cumulative operating profit. But in addition to those, there are qualitative indicators or qualitative criteria, which includes some corporate governance practice, like if a company have at least 2 independent outside directors, 2 is a large number for traditional Japanese companies, you can get a point, and you become more likely to be selected as one of the 400. And the portfolio of this JPX 400 is adjusted annually. So what we have been seeing is a competition among many Japanese corporations to be selected into or to become one of the good companies, or to be selected into JPX 400, or not removed from JPX 400. Okay? As we will see, a company like MUFG are well beyond these levels. So they are not really competing. I mean, their corporate governance practice has been much better than these levels. But many Japanese companies are competing to be in JPX 400, and to do that, they have been improving the corporate governance practice. And if you have been following the Japanese economy and the Japanese corporations in the past, this change that we have been observing is quite drastic. So roughly speaking, the Japanese companies didn't care about shareholders. Right? The shareholder value or increasing ROE was the last thing they talked about. Rather than valuing the shareholders, many Japanese companies mentioned the importance of customers and the employees. And many Japanese management were actually proud of that. So they sometimes claimed they don't have to worry about the short-termism, which comes from the pressure from the stock market, but they can concentrate on more long-term purposes or long-term issues to satisfy customers and employees and do more social good, in a sense. So that was the traditional company in Japanese companies in the past. The maximizing ROE or maximizing shareholder value wasn't considered to be important. Now, everybody, almost all the companies, are talking about the importance of ROEs, increasing ROEs, and started talking about shareholder value. So it's quite a change. And I guess this is the area where the Japanese government's emphasis on enhancing corporate governance is influencing the private sector's behavior. So we want to learn more about what's going on in Japan. So I'd like to invite Kazu to update us with current efforts.
Thank you, Hoshi-san. Actually, Japanese managers cares a little bit about the shareholders just one day a year on shareholders meeting. But anyhow, okay. Actually, that's for the corporate governance reforms. Has a sort of long history, maybe almost 20 years of kind of fight over the what we should do for the corporate governance in Japan. Typically, the type of the discussion we had was the corporate governance reform pressure is a sort of American conspiracy to, destroy Japanese capitalism, very typically, or some kind of conspiracy of the greedy, Wall Street guys kind of things. And but on the other hand, it's also true the so-called Japanese management system is not really working too well, especially in the last, 2 decades. So those are the things we have been getting stuck between those discussions. And as Professor Hoshi just explained, these are the very very fast-moving reform has happened in the last 2 or 3 years. And especially after the Prime Minister Abe came back to the office. And but this is kind of final event of the long-term sort of the battle over this issue. And let me explain about the typical discussion and issue down here. Basically, typically in Japan, the corporate governance is illustrated as a part of the more of a sort of a compliance issue, because we had a scandal of the Kanebo scandal, where I was in charge of the prosecuting the Kanebo in the case as in IRCJ. And also recently you have an Olympus case, and very, very recently we are now having a Toshiba problem. But then, anyway, the corporate governance is supposed to be a sort of a kind of compliance, the extension of the compliance. So in that case, typically the conservative people say that the corporate governance is nothing that different from compliance, and the compliance is as a business of, so-called Japanese Kansai, which is the auditor. So we have very strong auditor systems, and so you don't have to change anything about the corporate governance. And their belief is that the board of directors' role is kind of the management, not monitoring. Monitoring should be done by the auditors. That's the basic concept they typically insisted. So we don't have to change anything about the board of directors structures. That's the typical discussion we had. And also back to the shareholder versus employee kind of things. Shareholders, capitalism is a conspiracy of the American people. And so they basically hate those kind of ideas. We just do care about just one day a year about the shareholders. That's the typical kind of the discussion, argument. And so they sometimes use the stakeholders, focus as a kind of substitute of the salaryman forecast. So they say that the stakeholders are important, but amongst that, usually shareholder is not there. So that's the typical discussion there. And another discussion is that short term is just the Hoshi-san discussed. And if we strengthen the corporate governance, the company has to be very short-termism. So Japanese companies are more long-term view orientation, and we do care about the long-term growth and employment retention rather than the short-term profit for the shareholders. That's typically they argued. And so anyway, those discussion has been done more than 10 or 20 years in Japan. So let me discuss a little bit the reason behind why those things recently changed very drastically. And those are actually the fact basis. As for the revenue or growth of Japanese company, you can see what happened in the last decades about their market share in world economy. In the Fortune 500, Japanese company lost 2/3 of the company in those lists during these 20 years. But on the other hand, actually those the numbers are replaced by the emerging countries companies like China or Russia or Brazil. But actually at the same time, U.S. company and European company has lost just 10 to 20%. So basically, only Japanese company lost huge number or huge share in the 500. So it implies that even though Japanese managers typically say that you are long-term growth focus rather than short-term profit, but the fact is they have been losing market shares. They are not growing in the long run because this is 20 years trend. So this is the fact. Okay, then this is a very typical story about what happened in the electronics industry in Japan. Still, the frontline, engineers and technicians and product development kind of capability is very high in Japan. So in many areas, still Japanese company has been leading develop the new business, a new market. They are actually very innovative, actually, and technically. But when the market grows, they typically lose the market share to Chinese or Taiwanese or Korean or American or European, whoever. And this is what really happened in many industries. So why does it happen? So a very typical kind of analysis by the business school professor is that in the digital kind of technology, digital revolutions in those areas, when the market start take off and the commoditization happens very quickly. So in that case, the key success factor for in the competition is that we need more scale and volume and cost competitiveness. So it requires a very quick consolidation amongst the companies. But the Japanese companies are very, very slow in terms of the consolidations, and still 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 companies are competing each other domestically in Japan, and they lose to the more consolidated players in Korea or America or Europe. That's what is happening in these markets. And very surprisingly, the same pattern is repeating still today. It's repeating in the small size LCD as well. So why they make the same mistakes over and over again? So that's a real question, but it implies that something is wrong in terms of the management and management, including the corporate governance structures. Then, okay, maybe you can skip this. And if you look at the productivity of the front line, this is the labor productivity of the many Japanese industries. And at least it's quite sure as for the manufacturing company, which are competing globally, they are very productive. So it means frontline, productivity is very high. So, but the question is how about the productivity or capability of the management? So even though we have very strong frontline workers, frontline, engineers, but Japanese company has been losing the competition. Okay, so, and eventually the employees. Typically, they argue that unlike American company, they fire the employees every day. We have been retaining the employees, and we have been cherishing those employees. But the fact is that in Japan, the people who are working at the large corporation is gradually declining. So it means they have been retaining the incumbent workers inside the company. But to keep those people, many Japanese companies slow down or stop the recruiting the new people from the college for a long time. So as a result, as a whole, those large corporations has been losing the employment as a whole society scale. So it has been creating a so-called lost generation in Japan. So maybe age 20s or early 30s who are not able to join the large corporation after the graduation from the college, and they were not really well trained, and they are typically now still working at the so-called hiseki as a part-time workers in Japan. So this is now becoming a very serious social issue. So it means they are arguing that we have been cherishing the people, but as a whole society, it's not true. So they have been losing the market share, they have been losing the growth, they have been losing the profit, they have been losing the employees. So how can we say that they say, oh, Japanese management system is still very working well, but it's not true. And this kind of the facts or the understanding seems to be shared gradually, especially recent 5-6 years, because these are the facts. No doubt about it. So those are the typical discussions we made at the committee of the Corporate Governance Code. And also recently, led by the government, government wrapped up the very famous Ito report that's discussing about why the ROE of Japanese companies is such a low. And final discussion has been made by the typical Japanese managers our ROE is low because the American ROE is very high because American companies are too much focused on the shareholders, and they have been leveraging too much to raise the ROE. But it's not true anymore. After the Lehman shock, leverage of the American company went down as well. So as for the debt equity ratio, there's no difference between American and Japanese or Europe. Simply ROS of Japanese companies are very low. So you can, I can guess from the what's happening in the market. So they have excess competition within Japan, and they have been sacrificing the profit to survive those very excess competition because they basically, reluctant to make the consolidation. Especially they're very reluctant to sell their own business to somebody else, even though their ROIC is 2-3%. They never sell. So that's why, naturally, the ROC is very low. So they have been losing in the actually product market rather than equity market. So they have been complaining we have been winning the product market, but we are not serious about the equity market. But it's not true. Their ROE is very low because they have been losing the product market. So that's the truth. So those are typical discussions we have been making. I've been making in the last maybe 1 to 2 years, especially in the committee of the Corporate Governance Code planning. And but still, those kind of conservative people, especially the Kedanren kind of people who are arguing, this will never be translated in Japanese, please. Anyhow, those are the very typical discussion we had. And then anyway, fact is fact. So the conclusion or outcome of those discussions is that the problem we have is that anyway, the average conventional Japanese corporate governance practice has not been successful. This was really shared at the committee. And so, and especially the problem is not just the compliance issue, but also the more seriously the growth. So the corporate governance should be reformed to raise the competitiveness and growth capability of Japanese company. That's why, the shared understanding leads to the corporate governance reform to be one of the core growth strategy of Abenomics, of the third arrow. So this is actually pretty much shared within the government already, and then eventually shared amongst the industrial community in Japan. So that's what we have happened. And then, so more emphasis on the offense governance than just the defensive things. And also, we should focus more on the monitoring monitoring function of the board of directors, because anyway, the board of directors is not really working well as for the continuously enhancing the value of the corporation, the growth of the corporation. And also stakeholders oriented, but not have salaryman supremacy at the core instead of shareholders. Actually, typically what the Kedanen people discussed was that Japanese companies are very good because of that communitarianism nature. And communitarianism of the employees, or rather the salaryman lifetime employment workers. And but in many cases, those nature disturb their more quick and appropriate reaction to the fast changing environments, because those very internal orientation and communitarianism orientation sometimes reduce their capability to change themselves, because that naturally drives the strong inertia of the as it is. So those are the things, the big problems. So, but on the other hand, to avoid the very typical, criticism of the shareholders' supremacy is American way or something like that. So this time, our discussion is end up with the more stakeholder-oriented, but in the core of the stakeholders are shareholders. That's the kind of concept we concluded this time. And of course, the long-term sustainable corporate growth is very important, rather than the short-term, today's stock price kind of things. And then, and eventually, how to rule this, reform, we pick up the principle-based rather than rule-based. So we pick up the so-called comply and explain approach. So eventually, it's a freedom of each company that what kind of the corporate governance structure they take, but we show some kind of best practice kind of principle as a principle in the code. So if each company take the different approach as for the corporate governance structures, they should explain. If they can explain why this different type of approach is better for that company, they have the chance to explain. But this is a kind of principle. But in practically, what we aimed was that you can, see from the typical Japanese behavior, the company's behavior more like communitarianism. It means Me Too behaviors. So if we take this kind of principle, as Hoshi-san mentioned, until yesterday nobody talks about RE, but all of a sudden everybody talks about RE. And until yesterday, everybody hated RE, but now everybody like RE. So it's a sort of kind of good or bad. It's the nature of the typical Japanese conservative managers. So I don't think too many managers are courageous enough to explain. So these rules can be very effective to change whole things. That's my kind of expectation that we had, and they really happening that way. So I recently saying that to the institutional investor that if you can find any company who rather explain than comply, you should buy that stock, right? But so far I don't see any company that explains. But anyhow, that's really happening. So let me go to the sort of maybe you can see there's some kind of a tool we take, but it's not a big issue here. So and so so just a couple of points. Two big issues we had. One is how to do with the outside directors in terms of the corporate governance structures, and I very much strongly insisted at least two board of the independent outside directors should be there because the problem of Japanese companies is too much homogeneity. all male, age 50 or 60 or higher, graduate from the top university, like a Tokyo University, all those three people, and Japanese. So those are very typical profile of Japanese companies. So no non-Japanese, no foreigners, no females. So it's very, very homogeneous, and it drives those strong inertia or momentum for the keep the status quo. So that's why I'm pretty much insisted on to the at least two people should be coming from outside to change that kind of their behaviors. And the other thing is the cross-holding. And the cross-holding is sometimes workable when that cross-holding has some clear economic reasons to enhance the long-term growth of the company. But practically, in many cases, cross-holdings kill the governance power from the shareholders because that will mutually distinguish that kind of function of shareholders. And typically, that works very well for mutually self-protection treaty between weak managers because they can defend each other. So that's why, again, typical Keidanren type of companies, managers are very much sticking to the cross-holding. Sometimes cross-holding the criticism goes to the typically Japanese mega banks, but in fact, actually, during this discussion, banks are very, silent. And actually, industrial community was very, very vocal about keeping the cross-holding structures. And so the more they, argue the necessity of the cross-holding, I think the more we should get rid of that. Because it implies that they are not confident about themselves. I'm on the board member of the Omron. Omron never need any cross-holding to protect the current CEOs and COOs. They are very, very capable. And they are selected by the independent nomination committee led by myself. I'm the commissioner, the chairman of the committee, and we are fully delegated to select who is the best person to be CEO. And we chose the current CEO Yamada-san 3 years ago, and he's performing extremely well. And so we don't need any cross-holding to keep the Yamada-san in that position because shareholders all support him as long as he's doing well as a CEO. It's clear. So anyhow, those are the things. And the ROE, the importance of the ROE is that will enhance or accelerate the metabolism of the business portfolios and functional portfolio so that they can meet the very fast changing environment in the business environment. So and sometimes, ROE, if you lose control in the ROE, they can keep all the business even though those businesses are very inefficient. So now the 10% is a sort of benchmark in Japan. So if the investment, the return on investment is very low, you cannot justify it under the ROE 10% requirement. They should give up, or they should really concentrate more resources onto that, enhance their competitiveness. So that will encourage the, speed up the currently very slow metabolism of Japanese companies. So those are the things we have done. And a couple of interesting data I can show you. This is a profile of the top management of Japanese companies. Many of them are promoted from the inside. It's very typical. But actually, in US companies, also typically they are promoted from the inside. But the very interesting big difference is that in Japan, 75% of the CEO never changed his job or her job. All the way same company, single company. So typically, they know very narrow world. They don't know, sometimes they don't know anything about outside the company or outside Japan. So they are also very domestic. So typically, if you want to become the CEO of a Japanese company, you should just stay in Japan and stay on the same company all the way and just getting old. So I can't see they are seriously selecting the CEO. But that's the fact. So maybe the KPI, the indicator, whether this reform is really working or not, is that if we can, this kind of very unique situation of the selection of the CEO is changing or not. Because sometimes governance structure is pretty much reflected to what kind of person to be a CEO. Okay, so it must be changed because this is very unique in Japan. But Japan is very unique in terms of the CEO selection. But if the Japanese companies are uniquely performing well, this is okay. But the Japanese companies are uniquely performing bad. So we should change this. And let me conclude. Basically, this corporate governance reform aims to enhance the growth of Japanese economy as a whole. And so in many subjects, this is very important things, I believe, to accelerate the growth of the Japanese economy driven by the corporations' competitiveness recovery. But at the same time, now the speed of the reform is very much kind of high. So there are strong temptation that people try to kind of just make the alibis to meet the new rules. So, but anyway, the goal of this is not just setting up the new type of the format like more outside directors or more like different stop the cross-holding or selecting the non-Japanese CEOs. The question is the outcome as a business, whether Japanese companies can recover its growth, its profitability, its enterprise value in the long run. So that's a real KPI. But anyhow, currently, it's true that they are not doing well. And sometimes they try to blame those things to the exchange rates or high corporate tax rate or so on and so forth. All this due to the government's stupid economic policy. But in the case of Omron, exchange rate does nothing to do with. Because now they are 70% of the revenue is coming from the overseas, in the overseas subsidiaries. So exchange rate, neutral, actually, already. Because if you are fully globalized, the company is not necessarily exporting from Japan to overseas. So both ways. So it's not, you cannot blame those things too. Actually, and the corporate tax rate, Omron is not paying too much corporate tax rate because they are more profitable overseas than domestic operations. So all those things are not really true reason why Japanese company has been stagnated. So more of the managerial issue. So the real challenge or goal is whether we can really change evolve the old style Japanese management system to be more new 21st century versions Japanese management systems. And I also agree with the view that just be copying the American model or copying the European model is not the answer. Each country or each company has its own history and own DNAs. So they have to develop their own unique answers always. So, but the problems we had is that we have been sticking too much to the old classic Japanese management style that was established during the high school period in 1960s to the 80s. But it's no longer working. So we have to develop a new model. Thank you.
Thank you, Kazu. Mr. Tanaka.
Well, Hoshi-san, thank you for your very kind introduction of me. And I would like to thank everyone for being here today. I am especially grateful to Professor Hoshi for inviting me to participate. We have been friends for a number of years, and I invited him to the board of Union Bank. As a matter of fact, he was monitoring my performance. I know we were all very interested in Mr. Toyama's remarks, obviously, based on his experience as a member of the committee for establishment of corporate governance code. As deputy president of Mitsubishi UFJ Financial Group, the leading financial group in Japan, my comments will focus on the reviewing of corporate governance in Japan by making a comparison to US processes. I will draw on my experience as an outside director of Morgan Stanley and the former president and CEO of Union Bank, as Dr. Hoshi explained. Let me just move on to next slide. My presentation today consists of two parts. First, I will review briefly, because Mr. Toyama did, the initiatives of the Japanese government from corporate standpoint. Then I will discuss MUFG and the enhancement of governance structure of MUFG. This slide over here shows transition from management model to monitoring model. Let me share some observations about the current trends in corporate governance in Japan. The newly established corporate governance code, as Mr. Toyama described, was designed in response to discussions about the establishment of stewardship code, Japan revitalization strategy, and the revisions to Company Act, and Nikkei 400. And in Japan, the management model is generally what most listed companies use. This takes form as being a company with a board of corporate auditors, which is very unique to Japan. And a board of directors is responsible for oversight as well as execution of business to some extent. That's the difference. However, under the Company Act, as a structure of monitoring model, a company with 3 mandatory committees, which has a board of directors focused on oversight only, is already available. In addition, with the recent revision of Corporate Act, another structure for the monitoring model, a company with a supervisory committee was approved and became available from this year. The Japan Revitalization Strategy, revised in June 2014, stresses the need to strengthen corporate governance as a measure to enhance a company's earning power. It also urges leveraging the expertise of outside directors to help design and evolve corporate strategy. Under such trend, the new corporate governance code strongly advocates a change from the management model to the monitoring model. Monitoring model is general governance structure here in the States. And the majority of most boards is composed of independent directors. Each member is expected to thoroughly understand his or her responsibilities, something like duty of loyalty, including a commitment to the time needed to fulfill their important position. In addition, board members are expected to support a diverse membership and, above all, prevent the board from becoming just a facade or rubber stamp for management. With the substance in place, I believe that Japan's corporate governance code will function effectively. Now, oops, is this page 4? Hold on a second. I'm sorry for that. Right here. Well, keeping this in mind, I will explain later how Mitsubishi UFJ Financial Group has enhanced the substance of its corporate governance. But before that, I would like to show my view on whether Japan's corporate governance code is adequate when compared to the global standard. MUFG is a GCFI, global systemically important financial institution. That's financial institution. As such, it needs to be extremely conscious of the Basel Committee's corporate governance principles, which are considered the standard for G-SIFIs. There are 30 G-SIFIs in the world. Basel Committee's corporate governance principles advocate monitoring model as a governance structure for G-SIFIs. And in that regard, the Japan's corporate governance code is aligned, particularly for mega banks in Japan. The Japan's code is also aligned with expectations of global investors and authorities and global regulators. For example, regarding independent directors, this Japan's code presents more than 1/3 of the board of directors, in addition to more than 2, which would be applied to a kind of mediocre corporates in Japan. When we look at common practice by global investors and government authorities, the minimum standard obviously is more than 1/3. And this should be the minimum standard for all G-SIFIs. Global governance regulation to G-SIFIs is applied by group basis as opposed to entity basis. Thus, building group governance is required. However, it is also necessary to build local governance due to recent practice of ring fencing by local authorities in Europe and even in the States. Japan's corporate governance code can be used as a common guidance for local as well as global governance. I want to pause for a moment and note that Mr. Toyama has done a remarkable job developing such a comprehensive corporate governance code in such a short time. He was a driving force for this corporate governance code. Now, let me move now to MUFG's corporate governance structure. First, let me briefly provide an overview of MUFG. You may also know that MUFG is a parent company of MUFG Union Bank here in California. It is also the single largest shareholder of Morgan Stanley, about 22% share. As I mentioned earlier, MUFG is Japan's leading financial group, and as one of the G-SIFIs, MUFG also has a strong presence outside Japan. As you can see on this slide, in addition to a comprehensive network in Japan, MUFG has over 1,150 sites in more than 40 countries. MUFG is developing a unique global business model as a comprehensive financial group that focuses on commercial banking with platforms in Japan, Asia, and the US. In terms of assets and income, MUFG is ranked in the top tier among major financial institutions. In comparison to 8 European and US financial institutions, MUFG was ranked number 4 in total assets, number 3 in deposits, number 2 in loans, and number 4 in net income. This slide shows the trend of MUFG's financial performance. As the graph shows, our results dropped during fiscal year 2008 following the Lehman bankruptcy. However, our earnings recovered rapidly due in part to the positive effects of Abenomics, and we achieved a record high net income in fiscal year 2014. The earning exceeded 1 trillion yen benchmark. During this period, MUFG made important strategic investments outside Japan, which have contributed significantly to our growth. For instance, in addition to the strategic investment in Morgan Stanley, we also completed the purchase of Union Bank stock to make it a wholly owned subsidiary, And in 2013, we acquired the Bank of Thailand, the fifth largest bank in Thailand, and completed the integration with our Bangkok branch this January. As a matter of fact, I was a kind of last man standing in the negotiation to acquire the Bank of Thailand, which was a very, very tough negotiation, and it was just by myself and the chairman of the Bank of Thailand. And you know, the transaction was almost broken. And I said, okay, I'm going to have a G2G meeting with the chairman, which meant gray hair to gray hair. And that was a very successful meeting. Now, this is slide 9. As you can see, MUFG is becoming a comprehensive and wide-ranging global corporation. Overseas revenue and the percentage of overseas shareholders are both nearly 40% of the total and continues to rise. In addition, locally hired employees overseas are now 38% of the entire MUFG employees, which is 140,000 now. In order to respond to the globalization of its businesses and structure, MUFG must evolve its corporate governance structure. We now need to be capable of explaining how we function and how we ensure accountability in governance to global customers, investors, and global authorities, as well as Japanese stakeholders. With this in mind, MUFG has steadily enhanced its corporate governance structure by establishing a group-wide risk management, compliance, and internal control framework. At the same time, we have emphasized the value of an external perspective from outside directors and advisors. This slide shows MUFG's current governance structure. The next slide will illustrate recent developments. Well, this is a little bit busy slide. However, since the fall of 2012, by the way, I moved back from New York to Tokyo, July of 2012. I started this initiative right after I went back to Tokyo because the governance practice in Japan at MUFG was so sleepy. And so we started this process, and we have been studying the effects of the revisions to the Company Act. At that moment, there was a discussion about the revision of the Company Act. So we started a process of studying what would come as a revision to the Japanese corporate law. In 2013, we invited specialists and established a management-level governance committee. The key person who we invited was the professor, the very famous professor of University of Tokyo, Shinsaku Iwahara. Shinsaku Iwahara and I have been friends since we were 18 years old. And so he was not, he has been receiving a lot of offers from major financial institutions to serve on the board. He refused all of them and came to this advisory committee. And we worked very closely together, and that was a very important important factor of this process. So now, we deepened in this process discussions on the future of governance with our outside directors as well. In addition, we have steadily promoted substantive improvement of corporate governance, taking into account the trend towards the monitoring model, which is the driving force behind the revision of the Company Acts. If you look at the history of the revisions, many revisions to the corporate laws in Japan, the trend was clear. the trend was towards monitoring model. By the way, we learned it from Shinsaku Yohara, by the way. In 2013, we added one outside director and established the risk committee under the board of directors. We also established the global advisory board and invited 6 experts from Europe, 2 from Europe, 2 from Asia, and 2 from the US. 2 from the US included, Mr. Roos, John Roos, former US ambassador to Japan, in order to strengthen the global viewpoint. In 2014, added more outside directors, increased the percentage to 1/3 of the total 15 of the board members. Every single year, we increase the number of outside or independent directors. And finally, we established the governance committee under board of directors in order to deal with these issues on an ongoing basis. We also began the process of evaluating board activities and refined our procedures, including decisions about which items to bring before the board and how members should be trained to better fulfill their responsibilities. All of these actions are designed to strengthen both the framework and operations and make substantive changes to corporate governance processes. We took a lot of practices from Morgan Stanley's experience. We were so fortunate that we have an alliance with Morgan Stanley, and I'm serving on the board of Morgan Stanley, and we took a lot of practices from Morgan Stanley. Now, this slide shows the list of MUFG's independent directors as of June the 25th of this year. The board of directors will have 17 directors in total. 9 directors from MUFG. However, of 9, 2 are non-executives, including presidents of MUFG's major subsidiaries. 9 includes all those subsidiaries, the presidents. And 7 directors are shown on this chart, on this page. And so, in other words, we once again increased the number of outside directors from 5 to 7. And the 7 directors appointed from outside. So, of 17, if you add 2 internal non-executives to 7 outside directors, 9, or majority of the board members are non-executives. This ratio of outside directors is more than 1/3, obviously. And the board of directors is a good balance between MUFG directors who have a profound understanding of the group businesses and outside directors who have external points of view. An effective governance and the supervisory framework has been achieved through regular meetings to both the board and the committees. And I'd like to share a few details about the Global Advisory Board. In July 2013, we established a Global Advisory Board to get advice and recommendations from a global perspective to enhance our global governance structure and business strategies. The Global Advisory Board has been functioning very, very well. We spend almost whole day every year to talk about various issues surrounding our management. As you have seen so far, now MUFG has enhanced the substance of its corporate governance structure. Now we have decided to further improve our framework by changing from a company with a board of corporate auditors to a company with 3 mandatory committees, which, as I described earlier, is the structure for monitoring model. This change was taken kind of by surprise by a lot of people in Japan, because people thought Mitsubishi is the most conservative company in the world. Nevertheless, we took a very bold initiative in this case, primarily pressed by Mr. Toyama. Now, there are three main reasons to adopt this new model. First, under the current governance structure, the board of directors is responsible for both oversight and execution of business. By adopting this new structure, we will separate the function of execution by the board of directors and give outside directors greater involvement to strengthen the oversight responsibilities. Now, second, under the new structure, the nominating and governance committee, which is mandatory under the law, consists mainly of outside directors. We will discuss and make recommendations to the board of directors on personnel matters regarding key management positions. And now, finally, we will create a governance framework appropriate for GCFE by adopting the statutory audit committee structure. This is more familiar to our global stakeholders than the structure with a board of corporate auditors, which is very, very unique to Japan. Although we believe that this new governance framework is more appropriate to corporate governance, the structure must evolve and be flexible enough to adapt to changes in the environment. Now, finally, I'd like to share my views on the importance of shareholder value for corporate governance. The second principle of the newly established Japan's governance code makes provision for, quote, appropriate corporate cooperation with stakeholders other than shareholders, such as employees, customers, clients, creditors, and communities, unquote. But it appears that this definition of the relationship with stakeholders is not a change from what was already in place. However, corporate management culture in Japan has been criticized very seriously for not focusing enough on shareholder value, even with listed companies who derive their capital from the general public. So in response to this criticism, the new code is generally very sensitive to the rights of shareholders, making them the most important priority. In addition to enhancing corporate governance, there also needs to be a focus on improving shareholder returns on their investments. MUFG announced a buyback of its shares and also increased dividends last September. We had a lot of criticism about this internally, but we did it. And we also declared our intention to be more conscious of shareholder return in the future, making ROE an important index. In May of this year, MUFG announced its new midterm business plan and published both midterm growth strategy and financial targets, including ROE and EPS. So far, the market has reacted very positively to the combination of our growth strategy, enhanced governance, and initiatives to improve shareholder returns. As you can see in the chart, MUFG's stock price performance is much better than other large banks in Japan, and it is outperforming topics. Our market cap is now ranked second in Japan, right after Toyota Motor Corporation. So thanks again to Professor Hoshi for giving me this opportunity to speak with all of you today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kazu. Thank you, Masa. We will be opening up discussion for the floor soon, but before we do that, I'd like to make one brief remark and one question to both of you, or mainly to what Kazu said. So the one thing is you mentioned these corporate governance reform in Japan was based on the facts and understanding of those facts. But we know that many policy discussions are not constrained by facts often. So I think it's a remarkable thing that these changes are responding to the facts. And that's just a short remark. And my question is, you mentioned about Keidanren, and for those people who don't know, the Keidanren is a group of the managers of the largest of the large corporations in Japan, and it's a very strong lobby group for many policies. And you mentioned those Keidanren types of view and the Keidanren's attitude about corporate governance reform, and they have been more obviously reluctant to the changes in this direction of the corporate governance. And my question is, what's their stance now? Have they now understood these changes and now going forward with these changes, or they are still resisting, or they've given up? And the related question is for Mr. Tanaka. MUFG is, as you said, the large, or one of the largest corporations in Japan, and as many people expected, MUFG, if anything, would be the last company to change in this corporate governance type of reform. And my question is, why could MUFG, or why is it possible for MUFG to change and implement this corporate governance? I think that's the answer. But so you must have faced huge resistance.
Okay. Actually, the resistance from the Keidanren this time was not really solid. They didn't have a strong solidarity as for the resisting this kind of pressure of the reform, and typical Keidanren companies like Hitachi or Komatsu, already they reformed themselves, and they have been recording very good performance constantly since their change, not just corporate governance, but also in many ways of their management styles. And so those are the fact that, that we are gradually finding the new way of the management, even under those classic old companies. So given that fact, it's very difficult for them to just sticking to the very old style is the best and idealistic, and there is no need for change kind of things. And not really. They could not make kind of consensus in both ways. Some companies are still very conservative about the changing their corporate governance and the governance structures and managerial styles, but typical Keidanren company like Hitachi or Komatsu already changed, so they cannot go either way. So I'm not sure I'm quite sure that there was not strong consensus that they were really opposing this change, or not they are really supportive to this change. So actually eventually their kind of resistance kind of disappears, and so that is because of the nature of that Keidanren's organization, because they are very typical salaryman companies association, so they can be very strong when the consensus made within that organization, but this time they were not able to build up a strong consensus. So eventually they become quite neutral about these changes. So again, so this is fundamentally the potential problem still there, because still many Japanese companies' behavior, or Japanese companies' management behavior, is driven by the very much consensus based. They just they put more importance on the consensus rather than companies' competitiveness. They try to keep the harmony of the organization rather than winning the competition against outsiders. So they are even okay with go bankrupt as long as the consensus is there. So yeah, yes, it's true. It's happening in Japan Airlines and Japan. It happened in Kanebo, and it's happening to some electronic company today. But anyway, but that is something really need to be changed. So there's still challenges there, I think.
Okay, thanks.
My personal experience of changing the corporate governance structure at MUFG is such that it took about 2.5 years. We started from the formation of the study group, which focused on the basically the changes, proposed changes to the corporate law in Japan. From there, we expanded the scope of our study to include some of the corporate governance practices, including the one at Morgan Stanley or Union Bank and those Western type of practices. And then once we finished this study by, say, the young general managers, I was a leader of that, we kind of, promoted this study to the next, management level, which included 5 top, management leaders of MUFG, including chairman or CEO and all those people. Then we invited, as I said, the Professor Iwahara as an expert, and spent approximately 6-7 months just focusing on, the understanding what has been changing. As a matter of fact, in the corporate banking, corporate law area, or corporate governance area, and also what kind of new proposals have come from regulators on the global basis. And then finally, as a third step, we created the formal governance committee under the board of directors. Those are the very important steps that we had to take to come to this point. But in the earlier stage of this step, this process, we had obviously hawks and doves. We had a lot of people who said, we just follow the instruction from Kedanne. And however, just the learning process, which we shared by 6-7 very important, business leaders at MUFG, created a kind of common understanding about what kind of changes have been taking place in the corporate governance area on a global basis, not only in Japan. As a result, at the final stage, everybody said, this is a way to go. This meaning, changing the regulatory, the governance structure from the legal structure, as a matter of fact, from the one that has statutory auditor system to the one that has only board of directors system with 3 mandatory committees. So I think it's very important to form a kind of group of people, leaders, at the top of the corporation, and create the same learning curve among those people. And in this process, you really need to have a very good input from the experts from various places. Then I think Japanese business leaders are smart enough to understand what they have to do.
Okay, let's open up for some questions. Yes.
Hi, my name is Neo Miyabe. Thank you very much for a very insightful panel discussion. I used to work for an investment bank, and I worked on quite a few cross-border mergers and acquisitions between Japanese companies and US companies. And one of the issues that comes up occasionally is the differences in executive compensation between Japanese companies and US companies. For instance, it was one of many issues when I worked on attempted mergers between Tokyo Electron and Applied Materials. So my question is, I would like to hear your view on if Japanese corporate executives in general must be better compensated in exchange for tighter governance and oversight by outside board members, and probably more importantly, less job security.
Okay, let's accumulate some of the questions. Okay, and yes, here. And please identify yourself first.
Hi, I'm Yusuke Asakura. I'm a visiting scholar at Stanford University, and I was former CEO of Japanese public company, MIXI. By the way, our ROE last year was 80%.
I know.
And my question is about what kind of role can activists play in Japan? So it is great progress that we can expect that we now almost all Japanese public companies have outside directors after corporate governance code. But it doesn't make sense if we don't have capable outside directors or they don't feel pressure from shareholders. So in that sense, I think there will be some room for activists play critical roles in Japan.
Other questions? Yes.
Hi, Chiaki Moriguchi, Visiting Scholar. Related to the first question, but one of the byproduct of Japanese management system based on the internal promotion of the CEOs are the low CEO compensation. And Mr. Kazu's discussion about American-style management, corporate governance, is having this independent nomination committee and compensation committee and so on, but still the fact that CEO compensation is exploding in the US. We can argue that Japanese managers are, good ones are maybe undercompensated, but still, so I kind of want to know, I confess my ignorance and would like to ask that how the American style corporate governance is compatible with this exploding CEO compensation? Is it despite or because of that part I would like to understand.
Okay, so three great questions. Executive compensation, too low in Japan, too high in the US, or both, and the other one is the role of activist shareholders. So
Well, I have no objection whatsoever to increase the compensation for me. Well, you know, a couple of things. When I was the president CEO of Union Bank, you know, I had a chief operating officer who was reporting to me. We had beer together, and his compensation was 5 times bigger than mine, but still I had to pay beer because I was his boss. I felt like very awkward at the time, but still, you know, we had a very good relationship. I mean, you know, it's a very, very tough, question. As a matter of fact, we are at MUFG. We have many. Every single year, we have increased the number of senior executives who are not Japanese, who are located in New York, who are located in London, and their compensations are much higher than our CEOs. No, there is a clear difference between the compensation structure in their markets, New York or London, and in Tokyo. One of the reasons why the compensation in Japan is so low is, number one, if your compensation is bigger than 1 million yen, you have to disclose it. It's a very small number, as a matter of fact. And if your compensation is disclosed, you get a lot of requests for, say, a charitable contribution or something like that. Yeah. And so forth, and that's a very important point. But based upon my experience, on the board of Morgan Stanley, their compensation is much more higher. This is kind of awkward situation because Morgan Stanley in 2008 was on the brink of bankruptcy. As a matter of fact, we rescued them, but their compensation is 10 times higher. Right? But if you look at the components of their compensation, the cash portion is very small. I mean, it's almost 1/10 of their compensation.
Right.
And the remaining portion is restricted stock or stock option and so forth, clearly tied to the performance of the company. And there is a clawback, the provision and so forth. So we have to compare the executive compensation structure as well as ours. Ours is basically the cash portion, plus basically quasi-cash type of the portion of the bonus portion. So I think this would remain as the very important the issue for the management of the companies in Japan that is globalizing its operations.
My turn.
Talk about activist shareholders.
Okay, maybe both related because the Omron is also facing the same problem because they are now globalized and more than third of employees are non-Japanese already. So they are more and more international people are getting promoted. And of course, the outside of Japan, most of the cases, management layer of the people have a more open labor market. So the price typically decided by the market, supply and demand. So most of the case, that is more expensive than Japanese. So maybe that's one difference, the explanation why that gap. And basically in Japan, typically the liquidity of the high-class managers are very low. Almost there, no market. So market is not working too well. So, but another point is that utility function is sometimes different as a motivation scheme or incentives. So in the case of Omron, typically Japanese managers, including Yamada-san, might be responding to the some incentive until maybe 1 億円, 1 million, or maybe 2 million, something like that. But I don't think they're going to be incentivized by more than that. So that's simply a difference of the utility function, how far you can respond to the monetary incentives. And sometimes the respect or some sort of kind of, more emotional things might be important for those people to be getting encouraged to enhance the value of the company. So of course, those many things are, maybe Americans are typically more, the utility function goes that way. And the Japanese typically flat out, typically. So, so this is a very difficult question because many things are kind of, set behind. But anyhow, but gradually, and that we have that maybe that difference gonna be, it should be narrowed in the long run because now the global kind of top leadership people are now starting to treat them equally. But at the same time, those global, potential leaders might be transferred tomorrow from Japan to, South Africa or Southeast America or in the Middle East. But we are thinking about compensating on the more global market basis. So aside from the this is fair or not fair issue, because I'm talking about the more productivity issue. So after the productivity, maybe answer is somewhere in between, I guess. So so I don't think the American compensation scheme is working too well about the incentivizing those people, and sometimes they might bias their behavior to something different from the long-term enhancement of the corporate value. It's a matter of the function or productivity, and then also the activist role. If the activists are very smart, in terms of the smart enough or sophisticated enough to discuss over the long-term strategic growth of the Japanese company, it's okay. But the fact that most of the activists coming to Japan, quality is very low. I've been discussing with those people. They don't know anything about the business. They don't know anything about the strategy. They don't know anything about management. So they are just talking about the dividend, and they are just talking about the short-run stock price. So they don't create any value. So this kind of implies the stewardship code basically implies that the investor should be responsible for the long-term growth of the companies, because they have the governance power to change the management. So it implies that the institutional investor, especially activists, should learn more about the business and the industries and management. So it's simply, we don't have Warren Buffett in Japan. Typically, most of those people are very stupid, to me. So what I'm telling to the board, management people of the Omron, is that you should discuss with very sophisticated, smart activists, not just maybe American, maybe European, whoever, but you should now listen to those stupid activists. That's it. So you should spend more time for the engagement with a very, smart activist. So maybe on the institutional investor side, we should raise the more sophisticated, smart, well experienced, and the activists, maybe engagement kind of fund. So then that way we can discuss the long-term future of the company with those smart shareholders. That's another challenge we have. But anyway, at this moment, we have very few smart and sophisticated activists in Japan.
I'm sure this would provoke more questions, but we are running out of time. So let's close this here, and let's give another applaud for the panelists.
Thank you. ちゃんとこうステップ踏んでロジカルにやるとちゃんと動くんですよね。すいません。
よろしければ。どうもありがとうございました。すごくよかった。
じゃあ私の道は。はい。
Good to see you.
I have a question. I don't have time to ask. I want to ask about Lisa.
新しいです。